Sometimes, life changes, not with thunder, but with a song. Under soft wedding lights in a quiet Vermont garden, a woman named Clara Bennett, a shy high school music teacher, was never meant to be noticed. She didn't chase dreams anymore. She had learned to settle, to survive. But that evening, when her trembling voice rose through the air, something happened. Every sound fell away. Every heart stilled. And among the crowd, one man, a powerful CEO named Ethan Caldwell, looked up. He didn't just hear her, he saw her. What began as one unexpected performance became the moment that unraveled two lonely lives, one built on quiet sacrifice, the other on restless ambition. This isn't just a story about love. It's about what happens when a single voice reminds us that we are still alive, still capable of feeling, still capable of starting again. Stay with this story, because before the last note fades, you'll remember something too, that sometimes the smallest moment becomes the song that changes everything. The late afternoon sun was soft and golden, spilling over the rolling hills of Vermont like a quiet blessing. The garden was dressed in white and gold rows of folding chairs, lace ribbons, strings of tiny lights swaying gently above the guests. Somewhere nearby, the scent of fresh-cut grass mingled with roses and a faint trace of rain from the morning. It was the kind of day that felt like it wanted to be remembered. Near the small wooden stage, Clara Bennett stood just behind a curtain of ivy. She could hear the chatter of guests, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the hum of celebration that felt both joyous and far away. Her fingers were trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Clara was not the type who liked to stand in front of people. She taught music at the local high school, a quiet woman with soft brown hair always tied in a low bun, a voice gentle enough to calm even the most restless student. But today, her best friend, the bride, had asked for one thing. "Please, Clara, sing for me." Just one song. So here she was, heart fluttering like a trapped bird beneath her ribs, about to sing at a wedding beneath the lights. She had almost said no. She had told herself a dozen reasons her voice wasn't strong enough. Her dress wasn't right. She didn't belong among these elegant people. But then she remembered the look in her friend's eyes. Some promises, she thought, are not made with words, they're made with love. When the pianist struck the first soft chord, a hush fell over the garden. The laughter faded, the whispers stopped, and all that remained was the sound of music. Clara drew a deep breath. Her first note trembled, barely holding steady, but it carried something pure, something honest. Her voice wasn't the polished kind you heard on stages in New York or Boston. It was the kind that carried a story, the story of someone who had known loss, and still chose to sing anyway. As she sang, the sun lowered, casting long golden streaks through the trees. The light seemed to follow her voice, wrapping around her like silk. People stopped sipping their champagne. Some even forgot to breathe. It was as if the entire garden leaned in, listening not just with their ears, but with their hearts. And among them sat Ethan Caldwell. He was a man used to control of rooms, of deals, of people. At 42, he had built a company from nothing, commanded respect from men twice his age, and lived alone in a penthouse overlooking the city. He had everything, except the feeling that any of it still mattered. He hadn't planned to come to this wedding. He was only here out of obligation, a friend of the groom, a man who preferred silence to small talk. But when she began to sing, something inside him stopped. He didn't just hear her voice, he saw it. He saw the way her hands shook slightly as she held the microphone, the way her eyes closed when she reached the higher notes, the way her whole being seemed to pour itself into each word. It wasn't the kind of beauty that shouts, it was the kind that whispers and lingers. For the first time in years, Ethan felt alive. The lyrics spoke of hope, of finding light after storms. He didn't even recognize the song, yet it felt familiar, as if it had been waiting somewhere in the back of his mind, patiently, for this moment. Around him, people dabbed their eyes with napkins, smiled softly, leaned closer to one another. But Ethan sat perfectly still, his gaze never leaving her. When the song ended, The last note hung in the air like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Then came the applause, gentle at first, then swelling into warmth. Clara blinked, startled, almost shy at the sound. She bowed her head, a small, uncertain smile crossing her lips, and in that moment, her eyes found his. It lasted only a second, perhaps less, but to Ethan, it felt longer than time itself. She didn't know who he was. He didn't know why he couldn't look away. All he knew was that something in her voice had reached a place he had long thought gone. When she stepped down from the stage, the lights above swayed gently, and the golden dusk deepened into evening. The music faded, replaced by the sounds of laughter once again, the clinking of champagne glasses, and somewhere a soft breeze carrying away the echo of her song. But for Ethan Caldwell, the sound did not fade. It stayed, like a promise, like the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. And beneath the quiet hum of the wedding night, a single thought took root. Sometimes, the most unexpected songs are the ones that find us when we've forgotten how to listen. The music faded, but its echo lingered, drifting like soft light through the air, settling into hearts that didn't quite know what to do with it. Guests began to move again, talking, laughing, clinking glasses returning to the noise of celebration. But one man remained still. Ethan Caldwell hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. He only noticed when it left him in a slow, unsteady exhale. The woman's voice, her name, he didn't even know yet, had cracked open something he thought was sealed long ago. It wasn't just the beauty of it was the truth inside it, and that truth had hit him harder than he wanted to admit. He sat near the back, his chair slightly apart from the others, the way people with too many thoughts often sit. Around him, the fading daylight brushed the white tablecloths with gold. He could hear someone laugh nearby, a sound full of life, and it made him painfully aware of the emptiness that had followed him for years. Ethan Caldwell, founder and CEO of Caldwell Systems, had built an empire that reached across the skyline of Boston. At 42, he had power, wealth, the kind of reputation that made people lower their voices when he entered a room. He owned a penthouse with glass walls that overlooked the harbor where, every night, he watched the city glitter like a promise he no longer believed in. He had been divorced for 2 years, and though the papers said irreconcilable differences, the truth was simpler somewhere along the line. He had forgotten how to feel. He used to tell himself that success was enough, that the late nights, the deals, the endless emails were proof he was living with purpose. But lately, everything had begun to sound the same: voices, meetings, even his own thoughts like static in an empty room. Until now. When Clara Bennett sang, it wasn't perfection that drew him, it was imperfection. The tiny quiver in her tone, the fragile way she reached for the high notes, as if she were chasing something just out of reach. She sang like a woman who didn't know anyone was listening, and that honesty disarmed him. He hadn't looked away, not once. Her music had moved through the crowd like a soft tide, and for a moment, he wasn't the CEO or the man who'd failed at love. He was just a person listening, remembering what it felt like to be moved by something real. As the applause began, Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, feeling an ache there he couldn't name. He watched her bow, awkward, humble, the corners of her mouth trembling with surprise at the warmth she had created. And then, their eyes met. It was only a second, maybe less. But time has a strange way of stretching when two people recognize something they don't yet understand. Her eyes, gentle, uncertain, carrying a quiet depth, met his, and for that heartbeat, it felt as if the noise around them fell away. The air between them seemed to hum with something unspoken, fragile, alive. And then it was gone. She looked away first, disappearing behind the stage, swallowed by the lights and laughter. Ethan remained seated, staring at the empty space where she had been. His chest felt tight, his pulse quickened in a way that startled him. He had sat through symphonies, charity galas, speeches that had moved entire rooms to tears, but never had a single song, sung by a stranger in a garden, made him feel this way. He leaned back in his chair, trying to steady himself. Around him, The evening settled softly, the glow of string lights above, the murmur of guests returning to their small, pleasant conversations. Someone poured him another glass of wine. He didn't touch it. For the rest of the night, he found himself searching for her face among the crowd. Once, he thought he saw her near the rose arch, talking to the bride, her laughter quiet and genuine. But before he could move, she was gone again. And so, he stayed polite, composed, nodding when spoken to, while his mind drifted somewhere else entirely. It had been years since anything had caught his attention without calculation. He was a man of logic, structure, data, but now all he could think about was the warmth in her voice, the way it had cracked open the silence that had ruled his life. Later that night, driving back to his hotel through winding country roads, he rolled the window down. The air was cool, filled with the scent of rain and pine. He thought of her again, and without meaning to. He smiled. It felt strange, like a muscle being used after too long. He wondered who she was, why she sang that way, what she was thinking when she closed her eyes and let the music carry her. At a red light, he caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror, tired eyes, faint lines of sleepless years, and for the first time, he saw how lonely he had become, how long it had been since he had truly listened to anything, or anyone. Back in Boston, his penthouse would be waiting immaculate, silent, a monument to success and solitude. But something about that silence suddenly felt unbearable. Ethan Caldwell didn't know it yet, but something had begun to shift. A quiet chord struck inside him that would not fade. No matter how many miles he drove away from that Vermont garden, he had not looked away. And maybe that was the beginning of everything, because sometimes the heart doesn't need to understand right away. It only needs a sound to remind it that it's still alive. The drive back to the hotel felt longer than it should have. Ethan kept the radio off. Silence felt safer, less likely to betray the fact that something inside him had shifted. But as the miles passed and the night deepened, the song would not leave him. Her voice followed him like a soft echo, clinging to the edges of thought. By the time he reached Boston the next morning, he already knew he wouldn't forget her. And somewhere, back in Vermont, beneath the same stretch of quiet sky, Clara Bennett was trying not to remember. After the applause, she had slipped away through the laughter, the champagne toasts, the whirl of congratulations that made her feel both grateful and out of place. She found herself walking down a narrow path behind the reception tent, where the air smelled faintly of lilacs and damp earth. The soft hum of the crowd faded behind her, replaced by the whisper of wind through tall grass. She exhaled deeply, pressing a hand against her chest. Her heart still hadn't settled. The music was over, yet her body carried its tremor, the kind that comes not from nerves anymore, but from release. She had done it. She had sung in front of everyone, and survived. And yet, standing there beneath the dim garden lights, Clara felt something more complicated than relief. It was as if a door inside her had opened, and she wasn't sure what waited on the other side. Clara. There you are. The familiar voice startled her. Turning, she saw Julia Parker, the groom's younger cousin, approaching with a glass of sparkling cider in one hand and mischief in her smile. Everyone's looking for you, Julia said, out of breath. You vanished like Cinderella before dessert. Clara laughed softly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Just needed a little air. Crowds make me forget how to breathe. Julia grinned. Well, you earned it. You were incredible up there. I mean, people were crying. My mom had to borrow a napkin from a stranger. Clara blushed. Oh no, I didn't mean to make anyone cry. That's what good music does, Julia replied. Then, lowering her voice conspiratorially, she added, Also, I think someone out there couldn't stop staring at you. Clara blinked, startled. What Julia took a playful sip of her drink. Tall guy, dark suit, sitting near the back. He barely moved the whole time you sang. Kind of intense, actually. Clara's eyebrows rose. Julia, please don't start rumors. I'm serious. Ask anyone at my table. The man looked like he'd seen an angel descend from heaven. Clara rolled her eyes, though her cheeks warmed despite herself. "You've clearly had too much sugar." Julia laughed, the sound light and teasing. "Maybe. But still, if I were you, I'd be curious. A man looks at you like that. He's either deeply moved or writing a song about you in his head." Clara shook her head, smiling. "I think he was probably just being polite." But even as she said it, something inside her stirred, a flicker of awareness, a memory of a gaze she had felt, rather than seen, steady, quiet, almost reverent. For a moment, she stood very still, listening to the faint hum of distant music. Whoever he was, he belonged to a world far removed from hers. And yet, Julia glanced at her, noticing the faraway look in her eyes. "Hey, don't overthink it. Sometimes people just notice beauty when it passes by. That's all." Clara smiled faintly. Maybe that's enough. They stood there for a while, two women beneath strings of white lights swaying in the evening breeze. Julia talked about college, about a new job in New York, about love in the age of dating apps. Clara listened, laughing at the right moments, though her mind was somewhere else back on that stage, where she'd felt both exposed and alive. When Julia was called away by her mother, Clara lingered a little longer, tracing her fingertips along the rough bark of a nearby tree. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet she loved. Yet tonight, it didn't soothe her the way it usually did. It felt expectant. Somewhere beyond the hedge, she could hear the soft rhythm of footsteps. She turned instinctively, but saw only shadows, guests heading back toward the reception tent, waiters clearing plates, the faint glow of lanterns swaying in the dark. And still, the strange sensation remained of being seen. Far across the garden, half hidden beneath a canopy of twinkling lights, Ethan Caldwell stood with a drink untouched in his hand. He had told himself he'd say something, thank her, perhaps, for the song. But as he watched her standing there, her hair catching the last light of evening, every word he'd rehearsed dissolved before it reached his lips. He didn't belong in her moment, not yet. So, he stayed where he was, a silent observer in his own story, letting the distance speak for him. Clara turned once more toward the path leading back to the house. She didn't see him, but perhaps she felt him the quiet weight of a gaze that didn't demand, only witnessed. When she finally walked away, her steps were slow, her heart uncertain, and from where he stood, Ethan watched until the curve of the garden swallowed her completely. He could have followed, but something told him that what had happened between them, whatever it was, wasn't meant to be rushed. Some encounters, he thought, are like music. They end, but they don't really finish. As the night deepened, the guests began to leave, laughter fading into the rustle of leaves and the soft hum of crickets. Ethan glanced once more toward the path where she had gone, then set his glass down and walked away in the opposite direction. Both of them carried something unspoken home that night, something that would follow them beyond the applause, beyond the music, into the quiet places where change begins. And neither of them knew yet that the song was far from over. The night after the wedding stretched long and sleepless. In the stillness of his hotel room, Ethan Caldwell stood by the window, watching rain drift across the glass. Below him, the parking lot glimmered with reflections of taillights and puddles. He had taken off his jacket, loosened his tie, but his mind refused to rest. Somewhere between thought and memory, her voice returned soft, trembling, unforgettable. He didn't even know her name, but he knew he couldn't leave it at that. When the first light of dawn reached over the Vermont hills, he already knew what he would do next. Back in Boston, the city was its usual self, busy, loud, efficient. Skyscrapers mirrored the gray morning sky, and the rhythm of life moved fast enough to erase almost anything. Almost. Ethan's office on the 23rd floor of Caldwell Systems felt colder than usual. He sat behind his desk, surrounded by glass and silence, pretending to read a quarterly report he hadn't touched in hours. Numbers filled the pages, but all he could hear was the faint echo of that song, Lucas Hale, his personal assistant for nearly a decade, stepped into the room holding a tablet and a coffee. The younger man hesitated before speaking, sensing his boss's distracted mood. Rough morning, Ethan looked up, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "You could say that." Lucas set the coffee down. "Want me to push the board meeting to next week?" "No," Ethan said, then paused. "Actually, yes. Do that." Lucas blinked. "Okay. Should I ask what's going on? Or is this one of those don't ask situations?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "I need you to find someone." The assistant raised an eyebrow. "Find someone?" "Yes." "A woman. She sang at the Parker wedding last weekend, Vermont. Countryside venue." Lucas tilted his head. Intrigued. "All right. Name, I don't know." "Got it. Any description?" "She was in her 30s, maybe. Brown hair, soft voice. Teaches music, I think." Ethan's voice softened, almost uncertain. "She sang beautifully." Lucas blinked again. "Processing that. You want me to track down a wedding singer from Vermont." "Not just a wedding singer," Ethan said quietly. "Find her?" There was something in his tone, something final, that told Lucas this was not a casual request. He nodded, tapping notes onto his tablet. "I'll see what I can do." When the assistant left, Ethan turned back toward the window. The skyline of Boston stretched before him, sharp and gleaming under the sun. But for the first time, it looked hollow. Meanwhile, a few hours north, in a small Vermont town, Clara Bennett, the woman whose song had stirred something in him, was returning to her ordinary life. Her classroom was tucked at the end of a narrow hallway in Maplewood High, a modest public school where the music department shared space with the janitor's closet. Faded posters of Beethoven and Ella Fitzgerald lined the walls. A few pianos, all slightly out of tune, waited for hands that cared. Clara loved this place, the chaos, the noise, the small triumphs that came from teaching kids how to find their own rhythm. Music wasn't just her job, it was how she kept her heart steady. That Monday morning, she arrived early, as always. She opened the windows to let in the fall breeze, stacked sheet music on the piano, and greeted her students with a smile that hid the exhaustion beneath. At lunch, she stopped by the nurse's office to check her phone. There was a message from the home nurse who cared for her mother. "She's doing okay today. Slept through the morning. Don't worry." Clara sighed with relief. Her mother's heart condition had worsened over the years, and though the doctors said it was manageable, Clara knew better. Every day felt like a balancing act between teaching, paying rent, and keeping the woman she loved most comfortable and calm. The wedding already felt like a dream she wasn't sure had really happened. Did that man truly look at her the way Julia had said? She told herself it didn't matter. That part of her life, the part that dreamed, was something she had folded away a long time ago. Still, as she rearranged music stands, she found herself humming the same song she'd sung that night. And though she didn't notice, one of her students paused at the door, smiling. "Miss Bennett," the girl said softly. "You sound happy today." Clara chuckled. "Do I must be the coffee?" But when the bell rang and the hallway filled with footsteps, her eyes drifted toward the window, toward a sky the same pale gold as the one over the Vermont garden. 2 days later, just as the last class was ending, there was a knock on the door. She turned, expecting a student who had forgotten something. But instead, a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. "Miss Bennett?" he asked politely. "Yes," he smiled faintly, holding out a business card. "My name is Daniel. I work for Mr. Ethan Caldwell." The name caught her off guard. "I'm sorry. Who, Mr. Caldwell?" he repeated. "CEO of Caldwell Systems. He asked me to deliver a message." Clara blinked, her pulse quickening, though she couldn't explain why. "A message he'd like to meet you," the man said simply. "If you're available this week." She stared at him, bewildered. Why would someone like him want to meet me? The man's expression softened, professional but kind. "He heard you sing. For a moment, The world seemed to still. The fluorescent hum of the classroom faded. The sound of students outside blurred into nothing. Clara's hands, still holding a piece of chalk, felt suddenly weightless. He heard me sing, she echoed. Yes, the man replied, and he hasn't stopped talking about it since. After he left, Clara sat alone in the quiet classroom. Dust motes drifted through the slanted sunlight, landing softly on piano keys and old sheet music. Outside, the day had turned crisp and golden. She didn't know what to think, whether to laugh, to worry, or to pretend it meant nothing. But one thought, fragile and persistent, refused to leave her. Perhaps the song she'd sung beneath those wedding lights had reached farther than she ever imagined, and somewhere, in a city far away. Ethan Caldwell looked down at his calendar, and for the first time in years, a meeting didn't feel like business. Sometimes, fate doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes, it simply knocks quietly on a classroom door. For 2 days, Clara debated whether to go. The business card sat on her kitchen counter, right beside an empty teacup and a half-written grocery list. She picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. The name printed on it, Ethan Caldwell, felt too heavy for her small, quiet life. CEO, Boston, worlds away from hers. Her mother noticed the card one morning and raised an eyebrow. Someone's important, she teased gently. Clara smiled, trying to brush it off. It's nothing. Probably a misunderstanding. But that evening, when the nurse came by and her mother dozed off in front of the television, Clara stood by the window, staring at the fading light. Boston wasn't far, 2 hours by car. Still, it felt like another planet. And yet, something in her wouldn't let go of the thought. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe something deeper, the quiet instinct that life was giving her a second verse to a song she thought had ended. So, she said yes. 2 days later, she found herself stepping out of an elevator into a restaurant that seemed to float above the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire floor, offering a breathtaking view of Boston Harbor bathed in twilight. Tiny boats glided across the dark water, their lights flickering like stars come to rest. The air smelled faintly of roasted garlic, wine, and something delicate like citrus and memory. A waiter led her to a corner table near the glass. She hesitated, smoothing her dress a simple navy blue, the best she owned. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from fear exactly. It was anticipation, a strange, uninvited awareness that this evening might matter. When Ethan arrived, she almost didn't recognize him. He looked different from the distant figure she remembered at the wedding, less untouchable, more human. No tuxedo, no formality, just a dark gray suit, open collar, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He smiled as he approached, the kind of smile that didn't demand a response, only offered warmth. "Miss Bennett," he greeted, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." His voice carried calm confidence, but his eyes told another story, quiet fatigue, maybe even loneliness. She shook his hand, her palm cool against his. "Mr. Caldwell, it's nice to meet you properly. Please," he said with a soft chuckle, "call me Ethan." They sat for a moment. The silence between them was polite but uncertain, like two instruments tuning before a song. He asked if she'd found the place easily. She nodded. She complimented the view. He said he rarely noticed it anymore. The small talk felt fragile, but it was a start. Then came a pause, gentle, not awkward, and in that pause, something shifted. Ethan leaned back, studying her with quiet respect. "I hope this invitation didn't feel inappropriate. I just wanted to thank you. Your song, it meant something to me." Clara smiled softly, eyes lowering. "You didn't have to go through all this just to say thank you." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but when something moves you that deeply, it feels wrong to ignore it." She looked up then, meeting his gaze. There it was again, the same steadiness she had felt that night under the garden lights. It unnerved her and comforted her all at once. The waiter appeared, took their order, and disappeared quietly, leaving the city lights to glow around them like suspended stars. For a while, they spoke of simple things, music, travel, the strange pace of modern life. And then, as the wine breathed and the distance between them softened, the conversation deepened naturally, the way truth often does when no one is trying too hard. Ethan told her about his life, how he had spent years climbing the ladder, chasing milestones that felt empty once reached, how the divorce had left him not angry, but hollow. "How strange," he said quietly, looking out at the skyline. "You can have everything and still feel like you're standing in an empty room." Clara nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I understand that. Maybe not the penthouse part," she added, smiling faintly. "But the emptiness, yes." He glanced at her, curious. "You've felt that too?" "Of course." She took a sip of water before continuing. "I once dreamed of studying at the Boston Conservatory. Music was supposed to be my whole world. But then my father died. My mother got sick. I stayed, taught at a local school instead." Ethan's expression softened. "That must have been hard." "It was," she said quietly. "But you don't really think about it when someone you love needs you. You just do what has to be done." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "You gave up something for love." She smiled, a little sad, a little proud. Or maybe I just learned that love was the only thing worth keeping. For a while, neither spoke. The city stretched beneath them, its lights moving like rivers of gold. Between them, the air felt heavy with something unnamed, but gentle. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "You know, when I was younger, I used to think success was proof of worth, that if I worked hard enough, earned enough, people would see I was enough." He exhaled, almost laughing at himself. "Turns out, all I did was prove I could outrun my own loneliness." Clara's eyes softened. "Maybe we all do that run, until something, or someone, makes us stop." He met her gaze again. There was no need to name what that something was. The waiter returned with their meals, placing plates with quiet precision. Neither noticed much of what they ate. The food was background their words. The true feast. When the conversation drifted to lighter things, they laughed easily. Ethan told her about his assistant Lucas's obsession with mystery novels. Clara shared stories of her students, one who played trumpet like Louis Armstrong, another who couldn't clap on beat but sang with pure joy. It was simple, real, alive. By the time dessert arrived, the city had turned to silver and blue. Outside, the harbor lights danced across the glass, and the sound of distant waves reached faintly even up here, high above the noise of life. Ethan looked at her, then not the way a man looks at a woman he hopes to impress, but the way someone looks when they finally find quiet in a world that never stops moving. "Thank you," he said softly, "for saying yes, for reminding me what matters." Clara smiled, not sure what to say. "You're welcome," she whispered. And for a long moment, they sat in silence, the city glowing beneath them, two lives, two worlds, caught in the gentle stillness between what was and what could be. Sometimes, connection doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes, it begins with a quiet dinner above the city, where two strangers remember what it means to truly see and be seen. The night of their dinner ended quietly. No promises were made, no numbers exchanged, just a shared silence that said more than words ever could. When Clara stepped out of the restaurant, the city air greeted her like a familiar song, cool, salt-scented, full of life. She looked up at the glowing skyline of Boston and smiled softly to herself. It had been years since she'd felt that kind of peace, like her heart had stretched a little wider. Ethan watched her leave from inside the restaurant, his reflection faint against the window. He didn't call after her. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, realizing that, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Days passed. The world returned to its rhythm. But some moments, like certain melodies, refused to fade. Ethan found himself thinking of her voice at the oddest times between meetings, during late-night calls with investors, even in the quiet moments before dawn when the city outside slept. He tried to bury himself in work, but something about the encounter with Clara had stirred an ache that ambition could no longer quiet. So, he did what he always did. When something unsettled him, he looked for purpose. One Monday morning, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, Ethan called Lucas in. "Remember the music program we talked about?" he asked. Lucas blinked. "You mean the corporate outreach thing? The one that never got past the idea stage?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Let's bring it back. For real this time." Lucas frowned slightly. "You want to start a charity now?" "Not a charity," Ethan corrected. "A project. Something lasting. A program that gives kids access to music in underfunded schools." He paused, his tone thoughtful. "We'll call it Harmony for Hope." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Catchy? You already have someone in mind to lead it, don't you?" Ethan hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Yes, I do." 3 days later, a letter arrived at Clara's small rental house, a thick envelope with the Caldwell Systems logo embossed on the front. Inside was an invitation. Mr. Ethan Caldwell requests the pleasure of your company to discuss a potential collaboration on a community music initiative, Harmony for Hope. She read it twice, then set it down beside her morning coffee. The words sounded kind, professional, generous, even, but her chest tightened. Why me, she thought. She looked around her living room, books stacked on old shelves, a second-hand piano by the window, the faint hum of the oxygen machine in her mother's bedroom. This was her world, small, fragile, real. Ethan's world, on the other hand, was made of glass and steel. Still, she went. The meeting took place at his office downtown, a space too pristine, too quiet, with floor-to-ceiling glass that framed the harbor like a painting. Clara sat across from him at a long walnut table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Ethan, dressed in a crisp navy suit, looked calm but not distant. He smiled as she entered. "I'm glad you came. I almost didn't," she admitted. He nodded. "I guessed that." There was a pause, soft, unhurried. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Clara, I want to tell you why I asked you here. After hearing you sing, I couldn't stop thinking about how powerful music can be, how it connects people who would otherwise have nothing in common. I've been working on a project called Harmony for Hope. It's a fund to bring music education to public schools that can't afford instruments or teachers." He paused, watching her reaction. "I'd like you to help lead it." Clara blinked, caught completely off guard. "Me? Yes. You," he said gently. "You have something most people don't. You understand what music really means, to teach it, to live it, to let it change lives." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "I'm not qualified for something like that. I'm just a high school teacher." He smiled softly. "Exactly. You're the high school teacher who made an entire wedding stop breathing for 3 minutes. Clara looked away, color rising in her cheeks. "That's kind of you to say, but why me? Surely there are professionals more suited to this. People with degrees from the conservatory. People who belong in your world." Ethan's voice dropped, calm and sure. "Because your voice makes people remember what matters." The room fell quiet. Outside, a ferry horn sounded faintly over the water. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, her expression hardened just a little. "This sounds like pity, Mr. Caldwell." A kind gesture for the woman who sang a nice song and happened to impress you. His brow furrowed. "That's not what this is." She gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "Isn't it? You don't even know me. You just see a story you can save, and I've had enough of being someone's good deed." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "You're wrong." "Am I?" she asked quietly. He leaned back, his gaze steady, not defensive, but certain. "Then prove me wrong." The words hung in the air, simple, quiet, unshakable. For the first time, Clara didn't know how to answer. Something in his tone wasn't pride or power, it was challenge. And beneath it, respect. When she left the office, Boston was bathed in late afternoon light. She walked slowly through the busy streets, her mind a storm of thoughts. Part of her wanted to refuse, to protect herself from whatever this was. But another part, a quieter, braver part, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to do something that mattered. Back in his office, Ethan stood by the window again, watching the harbor darken. He had no idea if she'd say yes. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, he'd found something that made him hope. And hope, he thought, was a song worth hearing again. Clara didn't answer Ethan that day. She left his office with her thoughts tangled like threads she couldn't untie. For the next week, she carried his offer around like a note folded deep inside her pocket, never opened, never forgotten. Every time she walked into her classroom, every time she stood before her students and tried to coax a melody from an out-of-tune piano, his words would echo back to her, because your voice makes people remember what matters. At first, she tried to brush it off as flattery, a rich man's sentiment dressed up as purpose. But the more she thought about it, the harder it became to ignore. Maybe what unsettled her wasn't his offer, but the way it had awakened something she thought she'd buried long ago. That Friday, after her last class, Clara stayed behind, tidying sheet music and erasing chalk from the blackboard long after everyone had gone. Outside, the late autumn sky had turned the color of pewter, and the trees beyond the window were bare. She sat down at the piano and let her fingers find a familiar tune, something slow and unfinished. The sound filled the empty room, soft and hesitant, like a confession whispered to no one. Her father's voice came back to her, then gruff but not unkind. "Don't waste your life chasing songs. Clara." He had said it the day she told him she wanted to study music full-time. He'd been a practical man, the kind who measured success by steady paychecks and safe choices. Back then, she'd been too young to understand that fear sometimes disguises itself as advice. But she had listened. She'd stayed home when her friends went off to conservatories. She'd taught at local schools. She'd helped her mother when the heart problems began. She'd done everything right, except follow her own song. And now, sitting there in the dim classroom, she wondered if maybe her father had been wrong, not about responsibility, but about what life was for. Because wasn't music the one thing that had always brought her back to herself? She closed her eyes, pressing the heel of her hand against her chest. Beneath the hum of the fluorescent lights, she could still feel the small, steady ache of longing, not for fame, not even for recognition, just for that feeling, the one she'd had under the garden lights in Vermont, when her voice had found something larger than fear. Maybe that was worth chasing after all. The following Monday, she picked up the phone. Her voice trembled only slightly when she spoke. "Mr. Caldwell, it's Clara Bennett." There was a small pause on the other end, followed by warmth that surprised her. "Clara," Ethan said, "I was hoping I'd hear from you. I've been thinking about your offer," she began. "I'm not promising anything permanent, but I could try. Maybe a test session, see how it feels. That's all I'm asking," Ethan replied, his voice softened, genuine. "Try it once. The rest will decide itself." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Clara exhaled quietly. "All right then. One session." When she hung up, she felt both lighter and terrified. It had been so long since she'd stepped towards something uncertain, something that might hurt or heal. The next day, Ethan told Lucas, and for the first time in months, his assistant caught him smiling, a real smile, not the polite kind he wore in meetings. "She said yes?" Lucas asked. Ethan nodded. "One session. That's enough for now." Lucas smirked. "You're awfully invested in this, boss." Ethan turned to the window, the city stretching below. "It's not about investment. It's about believing in what people can do when someone reminds them they matter." Lucas tilted his head, half amused, half moved. "That's new." Ethan chuckled. Maybe I'm learning. When the day came, Clara took the train from Vermont to Boston, her bag filled with nothing but a few sheets of music and a borrowed courage. The school she was to visit stood on the outskirts of the city, a low, aging building with faded murals and windows that rattled when the wind blew. It was one of the many schools the Harmony for Hope project hoped to help. A woman named Denise, the program coordinator, greeted her warmly. "We're so glad you came, Miss Bennett. The kids have been buzzing since they heard a real music teacher was coming." Clara smiled nervously. "Let's hope I live up to that rumor." When she entered the classroom, a dozen pairs of curious eyes turned toward her. Children of all shapes, voices, and dreams sat waiting, some shy, some restless, some pretending not to care. She smiled at them, not with authority, but with kindness. "Hi," she began softly. "I'm Clara. I'm not here to make you sing perfectly. I'm here to help you hear yourselves." That was all it took. Within minutes, the room filled with laughter, clapping, and the off-key chorus of a pop song that half of them didn't know all the words to. But it was music. It was life. From the back of the room, unseen at first. Ethan watched through the small window in the door. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his heart fuller than he expected. When class ended, Clara stepped outside, flushed from energy and laughter. She caught sight of him waiting by the door. "How was it?" he asked. She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Loud, messy, perfect." He nodded, hands in his pockets. "So, do you still think this is pity?" Her smile faded slightly, replaced by something softer. "No," she admitted. "Maybe I was wrong about that." Ethan's eyes warmed, but he didn't gloat. "Good. Then we'll keep going one step at a time." She laughed quietly. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," he said, "but nothing worth doing ever is." As they walked down the hallway together, the light through the windows painted long gold streaks on the floor. Neither of them said much, but in that quiet, something new began to take shape, fragile, real, and full of possibility. Between them still stood the invisible distance of two very different worlds. Yet, for the first time, they both felt it might be a bridge instead of a wall. Sometimes, the past doesn't let go to punish us. Sometimes, it calls us back so we can finish the song we were always meant to sing. The morning of her first official class dawned clear and cold. Frost clung to the windows of the small rental car as Clara pulled into the cracked parking lot of Riverside Elementary, a school on the edge of Boston's forgotten neighborhoods. The building itself looked tired, paint peeling, playground rusted, a faded mural of children holding hands barely visible on the side wall. But inside, laughter spilled through the corridors like sunlight. Clara sat for a moment before getting out, her fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her heart thudded softly, a steady rhythm of excitement and nerves. This was her first day as part of Harmony for Hope. Her first day trying to prove to Ethan, to the world, and most of all to herself, that music still had a place in her life. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The wind bit at her cheeks, but she smiled anyway. Inside, the music room was smaller than she expected. A few dented music stands leaned against the wall. A scratched upright piano sat in the corner, and a stack of mismatched chairs waited in a lopsided circle. Still, there was something hopeful about it. Every imperfect surface whispered possibility. A boy with a mop of curls peeked through the door. "Are you the new music lady?" Clara laughed softly. Something like that. Within minutes, the room filled with children, some curious, some shy, some pretending not to care at all. They carried notebooks, half-broken pencils, and the kind of restless energy that fills every school at the start of something new. She began simply, "Today," she said, "we're not going to talk about singing. We're going to talk about listening." A few groans rose from the back. "Listening. That's boring," Clara smiled. "Is it? Let's find out." She tapped the piano gently. "Close your eyes." They hesitated. She waited. When the room finally quieted, she whispered, "Now tell me what you hear." At first, there was only silence. Then, slowly, small voices began to speak. "I hear the wind," said one. "Someone's laughing outside," said another. "I hear my stomach growling," a boy in the back admitted, making everyone laugh. Clara joined them, her voice warm. "Good. You're already hearing music, because music isn't just what we play, it's what we notice." She walked around the circle, tapping her pen softly on each desk in rhythm. Sound, silence, together they make meaning. Then she started humming a low, gentle note that filled the air like a secret. The children listened, curious. One by one, they joined in off-key, hesitant but honest. And suddenly, the little room wasn't so small anymore. From the hallway window, Ethan Caldwell stood watching. He had slipped in quietly, not wanting to disrupt. It had been Lucas's idea. "You should see her in her element," he'd said. And so Ethan came, expecting professionalism, perhaps talent. He hadn't expected to feel moved through the glass. He watched as Clara crouched beside a young girl who refused to sing. Instead of urging her, Clara handed her a small tambourine and said, "Then help us keep the heartbeat." The child's face lit up. A simple gesture, but it changed the whole rhythm of the room. Ethan smiled faintly. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen something so genuine, so completely untouched by agenda. When the class ended, the children crowded around Clara, chattering and laughing. One little boy tugged on her sleeve. "Miss Bennett, can we do this every day?" She crouched to meet his eyes. "We'll see. But promise me something you'll keep listening, even when I'm not here." He nodded solemnly. "Okay." Ethan waited until the last child left before stepping inside. Clara turned, startled at first, then smiled when she saw him. "You came," she said softly. He shrugged, pretending nonchalance. "Just checking up on the program." Her smile deepened. "And your report." He looked around the room, the worn walls, the scattered sheet music, the quiet after so much sound. Then he met her gaze. "It's the best investment I've ever made." She laughed, the sound gentle, touched with disbelief. "I doubt that." "I don't." He stepped closer, his tone softer now. "You gave them something money can't buy." She looked down, brushing dust from her hands. "It's just a small class." "Ethan." He shook his head. "No, it's more than that. You made them believe their voices mattered. That's everything." For a moment, neither spoke. The late afternoon light spilled across the floor in warm streaks, catching the fine dust in the air like tiny floating stars. Ethan studied her face, the quiet determination there, the glow that came only when she was doing what she loved. It hit him then. More clearly than ever, this was the difference between achievement and meaning. He had built things, towers, companies, legacies, but she built moments, and those, he realized, were what people truly remembered. As they walked out together, the sound of children's laughter followed them down the hall. Outside, the sky had turned to amber. Cars passed on the street below, but the world felt slower, somehow softer. Clara carried a folder under her arm, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think music was just what you played, notes, chords, technique." "And now?" Ethan asked. She smiled, looking out across the parking lot. "Now, I think it's everything that happens between the notes, the silence, the breath, the things we don't rush through." Ethan nodded slowly. "You're right." They reached her car. For a moment, neither wanted the conversation to end. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. "Finally," she said softly. "Thank you for this." "Ethan, for believing I could do it." He smiled, his voice low but sincere. "I didn't believe—" "Clara, I knew." That night, long after the city had gone quiet, Ethan found himself unable to sleep. He poured a glass of scotch, stood by the window, and looked out over Boston's glowing skyline. Down there, somewhere, people were chasing deadlines, profits, and progress. But all he could think of was that little classroom and the sound of children laughing. For the first time in years, he felt content not accomplished, but alive. And in another part of the city, Clara sat by her piano, her hands resting on the keys. She didn't play anything. She simply listened to the hum of the night, to her own steady breathing, to the quiet that no longer felt empty. Because sometimes, the most powerful music isn't what we hear. It's what stays within us after the sound has gone. For weeks after that first class, everything seemed to fall beautifully into place. Clara's music sessions became the heart of harmony for hope. Students who had never picked up an instrument before now came to school early, eager to sing. Teachers stopped by just to listen, smiling quietly in the doorway. Even the janitor hummed as he swept the halls. Ethan visited often, sometimes with Lucas, sometimes alone. He never interfered, never acted like the man who paid for it all. He simply stood in the back, watching the way Clara brought a tired building back to life. It was a good kind of routine, the kind that softens sharp edges and makes the days feel safe again. But life, as Clara would soon learn, has a way of testing the things that feel most fragile just when they begin to bloom. It started with a photograph. A reporter from the Boston Tribune had attended one of the charity events, a small concert to raise funds for the program. Clara had sung again, reluctantly at first, then with the same sincerity that had once silenced a wedding crowd in Vermont. Afterward, someone snapped a picture Ethan standing just behind her as she bowed, his expression proud, admiring. It was a simple moment, but the camera didn't see simplicity. It saw a story. 2 days later, the headline appeared on every major site in Boston. CEO Caldwell's new muse. The article gushed about the mysterious music teacher who had captured the attention of Boston's most elusive billionaire. It called her the woman who made the man with everything believe in something again. It was written beautifully. It was also devastating. By noon, the story had spread across social media. Blogs speculated, TV anchors smiled knowingly, and photographers appeared outside the school where Clara taught. A world she had never belonged to suddenly crashed into hers, without warning or mercy. When Clara saw the headline for the first time, she felt her breath catch. Her coffee cup slipped from her hand, spilling across her kitchen table. She read the words again and again, as if repetition might change their meaning. At school, the whispers began before first period. Some teachers avoided her eyes. Others looked at her with a mix of curiosity and pity. The principal called her into his office, his tone polite, but sharp beneath the surface. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I understand you're involved with Mr. Caldwell's foundation. We appreciate what you've done. But this kind of attention, it's not good for the school's image." Clara's throat tightened. "I didn't do anything wrong. I know," he said gently. But perception matters. Parents are calling. Some of the other teachers are uncomfortable. Maybe it's best if you take a short leave until this all blows over. She left his office with a forced smile and shaking hands. In the hallway, her students stood waiting, confused by the tension in the air. A little girl named Sophie tugged on her sleeve. "Miss Bennett, are you in trouble?" Clara crouched down, forcing her voice steady. "No, sweetheart, everything's fine." But it wasn't. That night, news vans parked near her apartment. Neighbors peeked from windows. Even her mother, fragile and kind, looked up from the living room chair with worry. "Clara," she said softly, "what have they written about you?" Clara tried to smile, but her voice cracked. "Nothing that's true. Mama, nothing that's true." She called Ethan. He answered on the first ring. "Clara," he said, his tone both relieved and wary. "Don't," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "Don't tell me it's fine. Don't tell me it will go away." He was silent. She took a shaky breath. "You turned my life into your headline." His voice came quiet. "I didn't, Clara. I swear, I didn't speak to anyone. I would never. But you didn't stop it either," she said. Her voice broke now, heavy with something between anger and heartbreak. "You could have. You're Ethan Caldwell. You could stop anything." He closed his eyes, the weight of truth pressing against him. She was right. He could buy silence from anyone, but not this time. The story had already escaped into the world, fed by curiosity, by hunger, by the simple cruelty of attention. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Clara let out a bitter laugh. "Sorry doesn't change that my students are being mocked, or that my school wants me gone. You meant well, Ethan, but you don't live in my world. You never had to." He said her name again, softly, as if saying it might hold her there. Clara. But she'd already hung up. That night, she packed away her music sheets and shut the piano. The air in her apartment felt too still, too heavy. She sat on the couch beside her mother, staring at the dark window where city lights blinked faintly beyond the glass. Her mother reached over and took her hand. "You know, honey," she said gently, "storms don't last forever." Clara nodded, tears glimmering but unshed. "I just wish this one hadn't started because of me." Her mother squeezed her hand. "Maybe it didn't start because of you. Maybe it started because the world needed to hear your song, and it wasn't ready to listen quietly." Clara smiled faintly at that, but her heart ached all the same. Across the city, Ethan stood by his office window, staring out at the skyline. The same papers that once praised his philanthropy now questioned his motives. Every headline twisted his intentions, turning what had been pure into spectacle. He thought about calling her again, about explaining, about fixing it somehow. But for once, he didn't have a solution. He had only silence and regret. When the phone rang, he hoped it was her. It wasn't. It was Lucas. "Should I issue a statement?" his assistant asked. Ethan hesitated. "No, let it fade. Anything we say will just make it worse." He hung up, his reflection staring back at him from the window, a man who had everything except the one thing he wanted to protect. The next morning, Clara didn't go to school. She didn't sing. She didn't open her door. Ethan didn't call again. He knew some wounds needed quiet, not words. For now, all that remained between them was silence, the kind that comes after thunder, the kind that feels too deep to fill. Because sometimes, love doesn't end with anger or apology. Sometimes, it simply breaks under the weight of the world, watching. The silence that followed the headlines was heavier than noise. Not the gentle kind that soothes, but the kind that presses down thick, cold, and endless. It filled Clara's apartment, her days, even her sleep. Within a week, she resigned from the Harmony for Hope project. Her message was brief, polite, and final. She thanked them for the opportunity. She said she needed time away from the city. She didn't mention Ethan. She didn't need to. By the time the last of her boxes were packed, winter had begun to edge into the air. The trees outside her window stood bare and still, as if holding their breath. Boston faded in the rearview mirror, its skyline swallowed by gray clouds as she drove north back to Vermont, back to the only place that had ever felt like home. Her mother's house sat at the end of a narrow road lined with maple trees, their branches skeletal against the early snow. Inside, the familiar scent of chamomile tea and wood smoke wrapped around her like an old quilt. Her mother looked up from her chair when Clara entered, her eyes soft and knowing. "You came home," she said, not as a question, but as a truth she had already felt. Clara nodded, managing a tired smile. "I needed to breathe." Her mother studied her face for a long moment, then opened her arms. "Then breathe here." For a while. That was enough. Days passed in quiet rhythms, the crackle of the fireplace, the kettle's low whistle, the creak of the floorboards under familiar feet. Clara helped with small things, folding laundry, organizing her mother's medicine, brushing snow from the porch steps. It was peaceful, but not healing. Because peace, she realized, isn't always the same as stillness. And silence doesn't always mean rest. At night, when the house grew quiet and her mother slept, Clara sat by the old upright piano in the corner of the living room. It hadn't been tuned in years. Some notes were sharp, others dull. Still, She pressed the keys softly, as if testing whether her hands remembered what her heart had forgotten. She played in fragments, half songs, unfinished phrases. Each note carried a memory: a child's laughter in a Boston classroom, a man's steady gaze beneath garden lights, the sound of applause that once felt like sunlight. She tried not to think of Ethan, but memories have a way of finding their own melody. Sometimes, she'd picture him standing by his window, glass of scotch in hand, looking out over the harbor. Other times, she'd hear his voice again, calm, low, certain, because your voice makes people remember what matters. She'd close her eyes and whisper into the empty room. Then why did I forget? The question hung in the air, unanswered, one afternoon, while she was organizing old music sheets. Her mother shuffled in, wrapped in a soft gray cardigan. "Are you going to sit there staring at that piano forever?" she asked gently. Clara smiled faintly. "I'm thinking—" Her mother lowered herself into the armchair by the window. "You've been thinking for weeks." Then, after a pause, she added, "Maybe it's time to start feeling again." Clara looked up. "Feeling?" Her mother nodded. "Yes. You can't let one storm drown a lifetime of music." The words struck deep, cutting through the fog of guilt and fear that had kept Clara quiet. She wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't that simple, that the storm had taken more than her job. It had taken her trust, her courage. But her mother's eyes were steady, and in them, Clara saw the reflection of the girl she used to be, the one who had believed that songs could change things. "I don't know where to start," she said softly. Her mother smiled. "Start small. One note, one breath. That's all music is." That night, Clara opened an old leather-bound notebook she hadn't touched in years. Its pages were filled with unfinished compositions, scribbled staves, half-written lyrics, faint pencil smudges. She ran her fingers over them, feeling the grooves pressed by her younger self. Then, quietly, she began to write, not to create something perfect, but to remember. The first lines came slowly, uncertain, but real. The melody she wrote wasn't about love or loss. It was about learning to live again, about standing in the quiet between what had been broken and what might still be whole. Outside, snow began to fall soft, soundless, endless. It blanketed the road, the trees, the rooftop, until the world looked gentler than it had in months. She paused her pen, listening. The house was still, but the silence no longer frightened her. It was the kind of quiet that holds room for healing. She whispered the words to herself, testing their rhythm. Each syllable felt like a heartbeat returning. Days turned into weeks. Clara didn't go back to Boston, and she didn't follow the news. The world, as it always does, had moved on to newer stories, newer scandals. But one morning, when the mail arrived, there was an envelope without a return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letter, no signature, just a simple quote typed in a familiar, deliberate font. "Every great song begins with silence." She didn't need to wonder who had sent it. She smiled, folded the page gently, and slipped it into her notebook. Then she sat back at the piano, her fingers poised over the keys. The first note rang out clear and steady, filling the small house with warmth. This time, she didn't stop after a few bars. She kept going, letting the music find its way through the spaces that words couldn't reach, because she finally understood. The quiet between notes isn't emptiness. It's the space where the heart learns to listen again. And sometimes, that's where the song truly begins. Winter in Vermont passed quietly. Snow piled against the windows, softening the edges of the world. Clara spent her days teaching part-time at the local school again. Her nights at the piano writing, revising, healing. The melody she had started that night in her mother's living room had grown into something whole, something honest. She called it the quiet between notes, but her students, as after hearing it once, had nicknamed it Clara's Song. They begged her to teach it to them for the end-of-semester performance. She laughed at first, hesitant. "It's not really a song for children," she said. But they insisted, and in the end, she couldn't say no. The day of the concert arrived in early March. The gymnasium smelled faintly of old wood and crayons. Folding chairs lined the walls, and parents shuffled in, shaking off snow from their coats. There was nothing grand about it. No stage lights, no microphones, no reporters. Just a handful of children, a small-town audience, and a single piano. Clara sat beside the instrument, her hands resting on the keys. The students stood in a semicircle, faces bright with nervous excitement. "All right," she whispered, smiling. "Remember what I told you. Sing like you mean it, not like you're trying to be perfect." The first chord rang out soft, steady, familiar. The children began to sing. Their voices weren't polished, but they were pure, full of heart. And when they reached the chorus, something beautiful happened. The audience fell silent. Every adult, every parent, every teacher in that little gym seemed to hear more than just music. They heard truth. Someone filmed it on a phone, just one parent, sitting quietly near the back. The video was short, 3 minutes, and shaky in places. But by the next morning, it had spread far beyond Vermont. The title read simply, "Kids Sing Teacher's Original Song, You'll Cry When You Hear It." Within days, the clip had been shared thousands of times. People called it a hymn for healing, a lullaby for grown-ups, the sound of hope, comment sections filled with words from strangers. This made me remember my mother. I played this for my husband in the hospital. I haven't felt something like this in years. The world, noisy as it was, had stopped long enough to listen. When Clara first saw the video, she almost didn't recognize herself. Her students' faces glowed on the screen, their voices weaving through the melodies she had written on a lonely night. Never expecting anyone to hear it, tears filled her eyes. Her mother, watching beside her, smiled softly. "Looks like your song found its way back into the world." Clara laughed through her tears. "I guess it did." Meanwhile, in Boston, Ethan Caldwell watched the same video from his office late one evening. He hadn't meant to. Lucas had sent it to him with a simple message. "You'll want to see this." When the children began to sing, Ethan felt his throat tighten. He recognized the tune instantly. It was hers, the one she had hummed in that classroom, in that quiet little room that had changed everything. He turned off the lights, leaning back in his chair as the music played. The city stretched beneath him, full of noise and motion, but inside that office there was only stillness and the sound of Clara's song. When it ended, he sat for a long while, staring at the dark screen. He didn't pick up the phone. He didn't call her. Instead, he opened a file on his computer, Harmony for Hope. Without a word to anyone, he signed the authorization for a second round of funding, anonymous this time. No press release, no logo, no mention of Caldwell Systems. He added one note in the private ledger, in honor of the voices that remind us why we listen. Weeks later, Clara received an unexpected letter from the program's new coordinator. It announced the continuation of Harmony for Hope, along with new instruments, scholarships, and resources for rural schools. At the bottom, in small print, were the words "funded by a private donor who wishes to remain unnamed." She didn't need to ask who. Some truths don't need signatures. Clara folded the letter carefully and set it beside her notebook. For a long time, she sat by the window, watching the late spring light filter through the trees. There was a calm in her chest she hadn't felt in months. Her mother walked in quietly, holding 2 mugs of tea. "Good news?" Clara smiled. "Yes. The project's continuing. Someone made sure of it." Her mother set the tea down and studied her daughter's face. "Do you think it was him?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "I do." Her mother's smile deepened. "Then you were both right for each other. After all." Clara looked out the window again, her voice soft. "Maybe, but maybe it's not about being right. Maybe it's about learning how to love without needing to hold on." Her mother reached over and touched her hand. "That sounds like something worth keeping." Later that evening, Clara sat at her piano again. She placed the letter beside her, letting the sunlight turn its edges gold. Then she began to play. Her melody had changed, still gentle, but now fuller, richer. Between the notes, there was space enough for gratitude, enough for forgiveness. She closed her eyes, imagining those children singing again. And somewhere, she felt Ethan listening, quietly, from miles away, no words, no contact, no promises, just music doing what love sometimes cannot. Returning, quietly, in its own way, the video would continue to travel. It would play in hospitals, classrooms, weddings, and living rooms. It would be shared by strangers who didn't know Clara's name, but felt her song in their bones. And each time it reached another listener, another heart, it carried a message she had only just begun to understand. Love doesn't always need to be seen. Sometimes, it's the silent harmony that plays behind everything good we do. That night, as the sun set behind the Vermont hills, Clara whispered into the fading light, "Thank you." She wasn't sure who she was thanking Ethan, the children, or perhaps the music itself. But it didn't matter, because the sound of her voice, soft and full of peace, was answer enough. Sometimes the heart finds its way back, not through words, but through the echoes of a song that refuses to fade. Spring came late that year. In Vermont, snow still clung stubbornly to the hills, melting slowly into silver streams that wove through the countryside. Clara spent her mornings teaching, her evenings composing, her heart quieter now, but not empty. The music had returned, and with it, something even more precious, peace. Then one afternoon, an envelope arrived. It was cream-colored, embossed with the familiar logo of Harmony for Hope. Inside was an invitation. "You are warmly invited to perform at the grand opening of the Harmony Center for Music Education, Boston Harbor, Saturday, May 20th, at the bottom. A handwritten note in elegant script. There is no one else this center would rather begin with than you. There was no signature, but she didn't need one, for days. She left the letter on her piano, unopened but never ignored. Her mother noticed. Of course. "You're going, aren't you?" she asked one morning over breakfast. Clara stirred her tea, avoiding her mother's eyes. "I don't know." Her mother smiled knowingly. "You've never been good at pretending you don't care." Clara laughed softly. Caught. "It's not that. It's just, I don't know if I'm ready to stand on a stage again. Not after everything that happened. Maybe that's exactly why you should," her mother said gently. "Some songs don't end where they broke. They end where you begin again." The words lingered long after breakfast, following Clara through her lessons, through the quiet hours of afternoon. That night, she sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the lake. Her reflection looked older, perhaps, but also stronger. Finally, she whispered into the stillness, "All right, I'll go." The Harmony Center for Music Education stood at the edge of Boston Harbor, a sleek, glass building that shimmered like light on water. It wasn't grand in the way of concert halls, but it breathed warmth. Children's drawings lined the entrance walls, handprints painted in bright colors. In the lobby, a banner read, "Where every voice matters." Clara arrived early, dressed simply in a flowing cream gown that brushed the floor like soft wind. The staff greeted her with warmth and quiet reverence. Many of them had never met her, yet they all knew her name. She walked through the hallways in awe, pausing before a photograph displayed at the entrance, a group of children singing her students. The caption beneath it read, "Inspired by Clara Bennett's song." Her chest tightened. She placed a hand over her heart and exhaled slowly. Backstage, she could hear the murmur of guests arriving, the soft rustle of programs, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. Somewhere out there were donors, educators, and maybe, just maybe, him. The event began with speeches. A young girl from the program spoke first, her voice trembling but sure. "Music taught me that my voice matters," she said. "Miss Bennett showed me that." The audience applauded warmly. Clara stood behind the curtain, tears glistening in her eyes. Then came the announcement she had been dreading and waiting for all at once. And now, to close this evening, the song that started it all performed by the woman whose heart helped build this dream. Please welcome Miss Clara Bennett. The applause washed over her like a wave as she stepped into the light. The stage was bathed in gold, and beyond it stretched a sea of faces blurred by brightness. For a heartbeat, she froze until she spotted the piano waiting for her, just as it always had. She sat, smoothed her dress, and let her fingers hover above the keys. Then she looked up, and that's when she saw him. At the very back of the hall, standing near the doorway, was Ethan Caldwell. No tuxedo this time, no entourage, just a man in a simple dark suit, his posture quiet, his eyes unguarded. Their gazes met across the room, two people separated by distance and months and everything that had come between. But in that instant, it didn't matter, because between them still existed what had always been there, the unspoken language of music. Clara took a deep breath and began to play. The opening notes were soft, familiar, like a whisper remembered from another life. Her voice followed, clear and steady. The melody carried through the hall, wrapping around the audience in warmth and ache. She sang not as the woman who had been hurt, or even the one who had been healed, but as someone who understood both. Every lyric, every breath, was a conversation between them, between the girl who had once doubted her worth and the man who had helped her see it again. Ethan stood motionless, listening. He didn't look away. He couldn't. He thought of the first time he'd heard that voice beneath the garden lights of Vermont, when he had been tired of living and she had reminded him how to feel. Now, here she was again, stronger, freer, shining in her own right. When the final note faded, the hall fell silent for a beat, suspended between sound and emotion. Then the applause began soft at first, then rising, filling the space with thunderous gratitude. Clara stood, bowed once, and smiled through her tears. Her eyes searched the crowd. He was still there, still watching, still listening. And in that one shared glance brief, wordless, infinite everything that had been broken quietly mended. After the concert, the hall buzzed with conversation and celebration. People gathered around her, offering congratulations, handshakes, praise. But through it all, her mind was elsewhere on the quiet figure she had seen at the back of the room. When she finally looked again, he was gone. Only an empty space remained near the doorway, and she couldn't help but smile. It was exactly like him to appear without announcement, to leave without asking for anything, to give quietly, without needing to be known. Later that night, as she stood outside the center, the harbor lights shimmering across the water, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Ethan." The wind carried her words away, scattering them among the ripples of the tide, and though she didn't see him, somewhere not far from the pier, Ethan paused mid-step. As if he had heard something, a familiar voice carried softly on the breeze. He smiled to himself, a small, private smile, and walked on. Because some goodbyes don't end things, they simply turn them into beginnings we never expected. The evening after the concert stretched long and luminous over the harbor. Boston glittered beyond the windows of the Harmony Center, the city alive with music, laughter, and light. Guests drifted toward the exit in small groups, their voices low, full of admiration for the woman who had made them feel something they couldn't quite name. Clara stood backstage alone, surrounded by flowers and fading echoes. The applause still pulsed faintly in her ears. She touched the piano one last time, tracing her fingers along its smooth edge, as if to say goodbye to the moment. The hall was nearly empty now, but as she turned toward the door, she saw him standing there. Ethan. He was waiting quietly near the curtain, hands in his pockets, the same calm patience she remembered, softened now by something almost fragile. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she drew in a breath and walked toward him. Neither spoke at first. The space between them hummed with words unsaid. "You were there," she finally said. He nodded. "I was. Why didn't you come to me after I wasn't sure you'd want me to?" Clara looked down, a small smile flickering at the edge of her lips. "And yet, here you are." He smiled faintly. I guess I ran out of excuses. They stood like that for a moment, two people who had once been everything and nothing to each other, caught again in the same quiet gravity. "Your song," Ethan said softly. "It was beautiful." She met his eyes. It wasn't just mine. It was born from everything that came before. He nodded slowly, as if he understood. The light from the hallway glowed around them, gold and gentle. "I wanted to come to you months ago," he admitted, "after the article, after everything fell apart. But I thought maybe the best thing I could do was stay out of your way." Clara crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, just thoughtful. "You were probably right," he exhaled, nodding. "Maybe. But I realized something while I was gone." "What's that?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. That walking away doesn't always fix what distance breaks. Sometimes it just makes you realize how much you care. She studied him quietly, the lines of his face softened by humility. "Ethan, I never needed you to fix anything. I know." He took a step closer, his voice low, trembling with honesty. "I never wanted to save you. Clara, I just didn't know how to stop wanting to see you happy." The words hung in the air between them, simple, raw, and unguarded. For a long time, she didn't speak. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. "Finally," Clara said softly, "you hurt me. Maybe not on purpose, but you did." "I know," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly. "And I hate that. You trusted me, and I let the world twist that trust into something ugly." "You didn't mean to," she said. "No," he agreed, "but intention doesn't erase the damage." She nodded, eyes glistening. "No, it doesn't." He swallowed hard. "I spent a long time trying to prove I was strong by building things. Companies, projects, donations. But I think the truth is, I was just scared. Scared of being close enough to someone who might see what I was really missing." Clara's expression softened. "And what was that?" He smiled sadly. "Myself." For a while, they said nothing. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows, reflected faintly on the polished floor. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn sounded, low and mournful. Clara took a small step forward, closing part of the space between them. "Ethan," she said gently, "you didn't destroy anything that wasn't already waiting to be rebuilt. I needed to fall apart for a while, to remember why I sang in the first place." He looked at her with something close to awe. "And did you—" "Yes," she whispered. "I found the music again, without fear this time." He nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. "I'm glad." She smiled faintly. "You should be. You helped me get there, even when you weren't around." He exhaled slowly, relief and sorrow mingling in his eyes. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted. "I don't expect anything. I just needed to tell you that I'm sorry." Clara studied him quietly, and for a moment, she saw not the CEO, not the man who had once stood at the back of a wedding, but simply Ethan, flawed, human, trying. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she stepped forward and reached out, touching his arm lightly. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of forgiveness. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that makes peace with it. When he met her gaze, something unspoken passed between them, the understanding that love, in its truest form, isn't about rescuing or possessing. It's about seeing someone fully, even after they've seen your worst, and still choosing gentleness. Her eyes softened. He smiled a real, quiet smile, the kind that begins at the soul. They walked together out of the empty hall and into the cool night air. The harbor wind carried the scent of salt and spring. Lights shimmered on the water, their reflections bending and breaking with the waves. For a while, they didn't speak. They simply stood side by side, watching the city breathe around them. "Finally," Clara said, almost to herself. "Do you ever think about how fragile sound is? How it disappears the second it's made? But somehow, it still changes things." Ethan nodded, like forgiveness. She turned to look at him, surprised, then smiled. Yes, exactly like that. He looked out at the water again. You know, I used to think love was something to chase, something to win. And now, she asked, now I think it's something you learn to listen to, like music. She smiled softly. Then maybe we're finally hearing the same song. The wind grew gentler. The noise of the city faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of the waves. Beside him, Clara tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her face calm, luminous under the streetlight. She didn't say the words, "I forgive you." She didn't have to. Her eyes said everything, and for the first time in a long, long while, Ethan Caldwell felt something inside him settle the quiet, certain peace of a note finding its way home, because some apologies aren't meant to be spoken. They're meant to be understood one heartbeat, one look, one breath at a time. The next morning arrived gently, as if the world itself knew it should not rush. The harbor shimmered beneath the early light, waves rolling like slow breaths against the pier. Clara woke with the sound of gulls and the faint scent of salt in the air. For the first time in months, her heart felt unburdened, not from forgetting, but from understanding. Forgiveness, she realized, had a sound of its own. It wasn't loud. It was quiet like a steady heartbeat returning to rhythm after a long pause. In the days that followed, she and Ethan spoke again carefully at first, like people learning a new language built from honesty instead of fear. They met for coffee near the harbor, always at the same small cafe tucked behind a bookstore. Conversations came slowly, comfortably. They didn't talk about the past, not directly. They talked about books, music, her students, the way Boston Light looked different in each season. Ethan told her he'd started attending some of the program's sessions again quietly, without anyone knowing. He said it grounded him, reminded him that impact wasn't about headlines. Clara smiled when he said that. "You're learning to listen again." He laughed. "I had a good teacher." And for the first time, laughter came easily between them. Not the nervous kind that hides feelings, but the warm kind that says, "We've survived the hard part." Weeks turned into months. What grew between them wasn't the wildfire of their first connection. It was something slower, steadier. A friendship that carried the softness of love without the fear of breaking. One crisp autumn morning, Clara called Ethan with an idea. Her voice, bright with quiet excitement, came through the line. "I have a favor to ask," she said. "Anything," he replied. "Come to my class next week. The kids are learning a new piece, and I could use another pair of hands. Or, well, one very expensive piano player." He laughed. "Are you sure you trust me with that responsibility?" "Absolutely not," she teased. "But come anyway." He agreed before she finished the sentence. That Friday, he arrived at the little school just after lunch, sleeves rolled, hair wind-tousled, looking slightly out of place in the humble hallway. But when he stepped into the music room, everything softened. The students looked up curiously, whispering to each other. "Class," Clara announced, her voice lilting with pride. "This is Mr. Caldwell. He's here to help us today." One boy raised his hand. "Is he the guy who bought all the guitars?" Ethan smiled, guilty. Laughter rippled through the room. Clara motioned toward the piano. "Think you remember how to use one of these?" He grinned. "Let's find out." As he sat down, Clara moved beside him, handing out lyric sheets to the students. The song was simple, a melody she'd written about finding courage in quiet places. Ethan played the first few chords, tentative at first, then steadier. His fingers moved gracefully, the notes falling into place like old friends returning. The children began to sing. Their voices weren't perfect, but they were alive, soft, joyful, beautifully flawed. Clara sang with them, her tone weaving through theirs, steady and tender. And Ethan, watching her out of the corner of his eye, felt something inside him ease completely. He had spent most of his life chasing the extraordinary, but sitting there, surrounded by mismatched chairs, scuffed floors, and off-key voices. He realized this was what love sounded like, not the loud, consuming kind, the quiet kind that hums beneath everything real. When the song ended, the children burst into applause, clapping and laughing. One little girl shouted, "Mr. Caldwell, you're actually good." He chuckled, "Don't tell anyone. It might ruin my reputation." Clara laughed too, and the sound of it filled the room like sunlight. Her eyes met his, no tension, no uncertainty, just warmth. "Thank you," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, thank you." The children were still chattering, some humming the tune as they gathered their things. One boy tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Miss Bennett, are you and Mr. Caldwell married?" The entire class giggled. Clara's cheeks flushed pink, but she smiled. "No, sweetheart. We're just friends." The boy shrugged. "You laugh like people who love each other." Ethan met her gaze again, both of them caught between amusement and a quiet truth too deep to name. Later, when the students had gone, the two of them lingered by the piano. Afternoon light poured through the tall windows, turning the dust in the air into drifting gold. Clara pressed one key softly, letting the note fade. "I used to think love had to feel like a song you couldn't stop singing," she said. "But now I think maybe it's more like harmony. You don't notice it all the time. But when it's gone, everything feels off." Ethan smiled, thoughtful. "Harmony," he repeated. "I like that." She turned to him. "You make a good harmony." "Ethan." He laughed softly. "I'll take that as the highest compliment." They left the classroom together, walking down the quiet hallway toward the parking lot. Outside, the air smelled of rain and leaves. She stopped for a moment, watching the children playing in the distance, their laughter echoing like music. Ethan followed her gaze. "You've built something beautiful here." "We both did," she said simply. He looked at her then, really looked the way he had that first night in Vermont, but this time, it wasn't about wonder, it was about peace, a recognition of something enduring, something whole. He reached for her hand, not to claim it, but to hold it lightly, respectfully, as if to say, "We made it through." Clara squeezed his hand in return. Her smile was soft, certain. In the distance, the children began to sing again, their voices rising through the crisp air. Ethan turned toward the sound. "That," he said quietly, "is what love sounds like." Clara nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes," she whispered, "it is." And as they stood there beneath the fading light, the world around them seemed to hum with something gentle and whole. No promises, no grand gestures, just the steady rhythm of two hearts finely in tune. Because real love doesn't demand to be heard. It simply stays quiet, patient, and true between every note that life plays. A year passed, almost quietly, the way time tends to move when life finally feels balanced. The seasons turned, each one leaving its gentle mark. Summer brought open windows and laughter spilling into long evenings. Autumn came dressed in gold and memory, and then winter again, steady, calm, and kind. For Clara Bennett, life no longer felt like something to chase. It was something to live, one soft note at a time. The Harmony for Hope program had blossomed far beyond what she or Ethan could have imagined. What began as one small class in a struggling Boston school had grown into a network of over a dozen programs across New England. Old instruments found new voices in young hands. Communities came together in gymnasiums, libraries, and church halls to celebrate music not polished or perfect, but honest. Everywhere she went, people greeted her with the same gentle gratitude. "Your song helped my child believe. Your story reminded me to start again." And each time, Clara smiled and said the same quiet thing. "It wasn't just my song. It was everyone's." Ethan remained a constant presence in the background of her life, though less like a shadow and more like a steady light. He visited the schools sometimes, usually unannounced. He sat in the back, listening to the laughter, the clatter of piano keys, the offbeat rhythm of children who hadn't yet learned timing but knew joy. The two of them saw each other often, but never with the urgency of before. No rushing, no longing that burned, just shared moments, simple, grounded, whole. They had learned to speak in silences, a glance across a crowded room, a nod after a long day, a quiet good night that carried more meaning than whole paragraphs. What they had now wasn't about intensity. It was about ease, about presence, about knowing that some bonds don't need to be explained. When spring returned, a new opportunity found Clara unexpected, yet perfectly timed. A small recording studio in Portland. Maine had reached out, asking if she'd consider recording some of her original songs. They weren't offering fame or fortune, just the chance to capture her voice, to let her music live beyond the classroom. She hesitated at first, as she always did with big things. Then, one evening, she told Ethan over dinner. He listened quietly, then smiled. "You should do it." "You think so?" she asked, still unsure. He leaned back, his eyes soft. "Clara, your voice started a movement. It deserves to be heard no matter how small the audience. Sometimes the right song doesn't need millions of listeners. It just needs to find the one heart that needs it most." She smiled, that deep, genuine smile he'd come to recognize, the one that meant she'd already decided to be brave. "All right," she said. "Let's make a record." Months later, the album was finished. It was called Small Light. 10 tracks each one, a chapter of her journey, woven together by her quiet strength and steady heart. Critics didn't line up to review it. It wasn't the kind of record that made noise. But the people who heard it, the teachers, the parents, the strangers scrolling late at night wrote to her. "I played this for my daughter when she was afraid to sing in public. My husband and I danced to your song in our living room after chemo. Thank you for reminding me that quiet doesn't mean weak." The album found its way, quietly but surely, into the corners of the world that needed gentleness. And that was enough. That fall, the Harmony Center hosted a special evening concert in Boston, a celebration of 5 years of growth, hope, and harmony. Clara was invited to perform again, this time not as a teacher or a guest, but as the voice that had started it all. The concert hall shimmered with soft light, garlands of white and gold looping above the stage. Old students had returned, now taller, more confident. Teachers, parents, and donors filled the seats. Clara waited backstage, calm but emotional. She could hear the audience murmuring, could feel the hum of anticipation in the air. When she stepped onto the stage, applause rose like a tide. She smiled shyly, waved once, then sat at the piano. "This song," she began, her voice gentle, "is for everyone who ever thought their voice didn't matter." The first note was soft, deliberate. Her fingers moved with certainty, her voice carrying through the hall clear, resonant, full of life. The song wasn't new. It was Clara's song, the one that had circled the world years ago. But tonight, it sounded different, more grounded, more whole. In the back row of the hall, away from the lights, Ethan sat alone. He didn't wear a tuxedo. He didn't stand or wave. He just listened. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his gaze steady on the woman at the piano. Every word she sang seemed to reach him directly, gently. He thought about everything: the wedding in Vermont, the mistakes, the rebuilding, the laughter that had replaced all the noise. He thought about how her music had changed him, not through grandeur, but through grace. When the final verse came, Clara's voice softened to a whisper. "We all come home, in the quiet between storms." Her eyes lifted briefly, scanning the audience, and though she couldn't see clearly past the lights, she somehow knew he was there. And in that unseen connection, something passed between them again, not the spark of new love, but the deep, peaceful recognition of two souls who had found their way. Ethan smiled then, quietly, privately, the kind of smile that meant everything had come full circle. When the applause thundered through the hall, he didn't stand. He didn't need to. He simply sat, listening as the sound of her final note lingered longer than it should have, softer than memory, fuller than silence. Outside, rain had begun to fall against the tall windows of the hall. Not the cold, angry kind of rain, but a steady, rhythmic one, the kind that carries comfort instead of sorrow. Ethan stood, slipped quietly into the night, and let it wash over him. Each drop felt like forgiveness, like renewal, like home. And inside, on stage, Clara closed her eyes, her last note still shimmering in the air. She didn't know he was standing in the rain, listening from afar, but she didn't need to, because somewhere deep in her heart, she could already hear it, the sound of rain that no longer wept, the sound of love that had learned how to stay, the sound of peace finally finding its way back home. Sometimes, when the rain returns, it doesn't mean the storm has come again. It means the earth is ready to bloom. The rain had fallen through the night, soft, steady, and kind. By morning, the world outside looked washed clean. The lake stretched before them, wrapped in a thin silver mist that blurred the line between water and sky. Clara stood by the window of the cabin, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Drops of rain still slid down the glass, tracing slow paths that caught the light. Behind her, the faint crackle of the fireplace filled the silence. Ethan walked in quietly, barefoot, the floorboards creaking beneath him. He carried 2 plates simple breakfast toast, eggs, and berries he'd picked from the bush by the porch. It wasn't elegant, but it was real. And real had become the most beautiful thing either of them knew. The cabin had belonged to Clara's father, once an old, pine-scented retreat near the Vermont lake where she'd learned her first song. After her mother's passing that spring, she had come here for the summer to rest, to breathe, to remember. Ethan had joined her later, not because they planned it, but because it felt right, not as escapees from the world, but as people who had finally made peace with it. They spent their days simply long walks through the pines, quiet meals on the porch, afternoons spent reading, sometimes out loud, sometimes in comfortable silence. At night, she played the piano, the old upright her father had once kept in the corner, and Ethan would sit nearby, listening, the way he always had. It wasn't passion that defined them now. It was presence. That morning, after breakfast, Clara wandered out to the porch, the woods still damp beneath her bare feet. The lake shimmered with tiny ripples where the rain still fell lightly. She breathed in the cool air, clean and damp, full of pine and earth. Ethan followed her, coffee in hand. They stood side by side, watching the quiet world before them. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Clara turned to him, her voice soft, thoughtful. "Do you hear that?" He paused, listening. "What?" "The rain," she said, smiling faintly. "It doesn't sound sad anymore." He looked at her, then really looked. Her hair was loose, her eyes bright in the gray morning light. There was something new in her expression, not the restless hope he had once seen, but peace. He smiled. "No," he said gently, "it doesn't." They went inside as the rain began to slow, the sound shifting from rhythm to whisper. Clara sat at the piano, tracing her fingers over the keys, their ivory worn smooth from years of playing. Ethan sat on the rug by the fire, his back against the couch, watching her. "Do you ever think," she said quietly, "about how strange life is, how everything we thought was the end was really just the middle?" Ethan smiled softly. Every day, she began to play a soft, unhurried melody that seemed to rise directly from the rain outside. No words this time, just music, simple and unguarded. As the notes filled the cabin, Ethan closed his eyes. He didn't think of the past, the heartbreaks, the headlines, the distance. He just listened to her, to the sound of the rain, to the quiet, gentle truth of being alive in this exact moment. When she finished, Clara turned slightly, watching him. "You always listen like it's the first time," she said. He opened his eyes, his voice low. "It always is." She smiled. You've changed. So have you. She laughed softly. I guess that's what happens when you stop running. He nodded and started staying. Outside, the clouds began to thin, letting in threads of pale sunlight. A breeze moved across the lake, carrying the faint scent of lilac from the hillside. For a while, they said nothing more. They didn't need to. Later that afternoon, Ethan found Clara sitting on the porch steps, sketching something in her notebook, a new melody, maybe, or just the shape of the rain. He sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. "What are you writing?" he asked. She smiled without looking up. "A song. I don't know what it's about yet." He leaned in slightly. "Can I hear it?" She laughed. "Not yet. It's not ready." He nodded, accepting that with ease. "I'll wait." She glanced at him then, eyes full of affection and quiet humor. "You always do." He smiled. "It's my best skill." They both laughed softly, the easy laughter of two people who no longer needed to be anything but themselves. As evening came, the light on the lake turned to gold. Clara lit a candle on the table inside, its flame flickering gently in the breeze that slipped through the screen door. Ethan poured 2 glasses of wine. The world outside grew still again, the air fresh and cool after the rain. They ate dinner by candlelight, not because it was romantic, but because it was peaceful. And when she reached across the table to refill his glass, their hands brushed, and neither of them moved away. In that small moment, unplanned, unspoken, everything that mattered was understood. No grand declarations, no promises that needed proving. Just presence, just love, quiet and whole, sitting softly between them like music that didn't need to be played to be heard. After dinner, they returned to the porch. The stars had begun to appear, scattered across the deep blue sky. The lake reflected them like a mirror, still and endless. Clara leaned against Ethan's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know," she said, "I used to think love was supposed to save us." He turned to look at her. "And now I think," she paused, smiling gently, "love doesn't rescue us. It reminds us we were never broken to begin with." Ethan said nothing. He just wrapped his arm around her and pulled her closer. The quiet between them said everything. Inside, the fire burned low. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath the stars. And somewhere between the fading sound of rain and the slow rhythm of 2 steady hearts, the last note of their story lingered not as an ending, but as a beginning that didn't need to prove itself anymore. Because sometimes, the truest love stories don't end with forever. They end with peace. And peace, at last, was the song Clara and Ethan had learned to play together. The rain had stopped, the music had not. And in the quiet that followed, life kept singing. In the quiet rhythm of Clara and Ethan's story, we find a truth that speaks to every heart that's ever been tired or afraid to begin again. Life doesn't always offer second chances with grand gestures. Sometimes, it whispers through small moments, a song sung under trembling lights, a kindness shared when no one's watching, a voice that reminds us of who we used to be. We learn that love, at its best, doesn't rescue us. It doesn't fix what's broken. It simply stands beside us while we remember that we were whole all along. And purpose. It's not found in success or recognition, but in the quiet places where our gifts touch others. So, when your days feel ordinary, listen closer. Somewhere between sound and silence, your own song is still playing, waiting for you to believe in it again. Thank you for spending this moment with Shining Stories. If Clara and Ethan's journey touched your heart, take a second to let us know. Please like, share, and subscribe so more hearts can find hope through stories like this one. Every click, every comment, every kind word helps keep these lights shining, one story at a time. Until next time, keep listening, keep believing, and never forget, your own story is still being written.